Welcome to Headline Wednesday from Dispatch, U.S. Military History Magazine, developed by Trackpads.com.
Each week, we take one pivotal moment from United States military history and follow it from the first warning signs to the final outcome.
Today, we go to the fields along Antietam Creek near Sharpsburg, Maryland, in the American Civil War, for the story of Antietam. For readers who want the fuller version, the longer print edition includes fact sheets and photos and is available on LinkedIn or by email.
First light on September 17, 1862, found a strange quiet over the rolling fields north of Sharpsburg, Maryland. Mist clung to David Miller's corn, and soldiers of the Army of the Potomac moved into position with boots sliding in the dew and bayonets clicking softly in the half-light. Officers tried to keep companies aligned as they neared an enemy they could not yet see. Across the fences and uneven ground, Confederate infantry from the Army of Northern Virginia waited in ragged lines, listening for the first signal that the day had begun. Many had marched hard to reach this ground, and they understood that their army was standing on northern soil with little room for error.
When the guns opened, the quiet vanished at once. Union artillery on the ridges fired into the corn as blue-coated troops advanced through the rows. Smoke, splintered stalks, and sudden death turned the field into a maze. Men could see only a few yards ahead as shapes appeared and disappeared in the white haze. In places, units fired at sounds and shadows more than clear targets. Officers shouted orders that vanished under the crash of volleys, and companies broke into clusters of survivors clinging to whatever cover they could find. The fighting surged back and forth, first driving Confederates out of the corn, then forcing Federal troops from the same ground they had just taken. Regiments that entered with full ranks staggered out with only fragments remaining. The same rows of corn were crossed again and again, so that no one could be sure whether ground held 5 minutes earlier still belonged to his own side. The Miller cornfield became a landmark of horror, but it was only one part of a larger killing ground along Antietam Creek. Before sunset, the sunken road, the stone bridge downstream, and the ridges west of the creek would all be pulled into the same struggle.
To understand why this ground mattered, we have to pull back from the smoke. In late summer 1862, Robert E. Lee carried the Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac and into Maryland after his victory at Second Manassas. He hoped to feed his army from northern farms, encourage pro-Southern feeling in Maryland, and win a victory on Union soil that might push Britain or France toward recognizing the Confederacy. A successful campaign might also embarrass Washington, sharpen northern political divisions, and show that Confederate armies could do more than defend Virginia. It was a bold gamble designed to change the political shape of the war.
For the Union, the stakes were just as high. Washington and Baltimore lay close to Lee's line of march, and Northern newspapers watched Major General George B. McClellan's rebuilt Army of the Potomac closely. If McClellan failed to stop Lee, Confederate forces might threaten key cities, disrupt rail lines, and weaken public confidence in the Lincoln administration during a season of elections and growing war weariness. On the ground, those questions reduced to farms, bridges, lanes, and ridges. If the Confederate line held, Lee could claim he had faced the main Union army in the North and survived. If it broke, the Union might crush much of his army against the Potomac. Maryland was not just another campaign. It was a test of whether the Confederacy could carry the war north and keep the initiative.
The road to Antietam began with movement, risk, and accident. Lee divided his army during the Maryland campaign, sending Stonewall Jackson and other columns against the Union garrison at Harper's Ferry, while the rest of his forces screened the operation. That created opportunity, because Harper's Ferry offered supplies, prisoners,
and a threat to Union communications. It also scattered Confederate units along mountain roads and passes at the very moment a fast Union pursuit could punish them. Then, Union soldiers found a copy of Lee's special orders wrapped around cigars in a Maryland field. McClellan suddenly had a detailed outline of Confederate movements, a gift few commanders ever receive. With that rare advantage, McClellan moved west through the South Mountain Gaps, fighting sharp actions at places like Fox's Gap and Turner's Gap. His advance pushed Confederate defenders back toward Sharpsburg and crowded Lee against the Potomac River. Yet McClellan's caution blunted the opportunity. He overestimated Confederate strength, worried about unseen reserves, and advanced in stages rather than striking before Lee's scattered divisions fully reunited. Lee sensed the hesitation and chose to stand on the ridges west of Antietam Creek, accepting battle against a larger army. By doing so, he transformed a dangerous retreat into a calculated defensive stand.
By the evening of September 16th, both sides were nearly locked in place. Union forces probed across the creek, batteries tested each other's range, and skirmishers traded fire in fields that would become famous by morning. On the Union right, Joseph Hooker's First Corps prepared to attack near the Cornfield and the woods beyond. On the Confederate side, men under Jackson, John Bell Hood, and others held fence lines, timber, and slight rises. They were tired from days of marching, but they understood they had little room to give. The next morning's attacks in the Cornfield were only the opening act of a day-long battle that moved slowly from north to south. Union blows landed hard, but not together. That rhythm mattered because it gave Lee and his subordinates time to shift men from one threatened point to the next instead of facing every Union corps at once. After the early bloodletting around Miller's farm, fresh Federal units pushed toward a farm lane sunken by years of wagon traffic behind the center of Lee's position. To the men who fought there, it became the Bloody Lane. Mid-morning assaults sent Union brigades up open slopes toward that trench-like roadbed. Confederate infantry sheltered in the lane and poured concentrated musketry into the advancing ranks. Flags dipped and rose again as regiments tried to cross the exposed ground, and wounded men fell in rows along the approaches. Some Union soldiers reached the edge and fired down at point-blank range. When a gap opened in the Confederate line, Federal troops gained a ridge from which they could rake the road from above. For a moment, it looked as if Lee's center might crack wide open and expose the road into Sharpsburg. But Antietam was a battle of missed connections as much as hard fighting. While the center struggled around the Bloody Lane, the Union left remained quiet, and the right had already spent itself in the Cornfield and nearby woods. McClellan fed attacks into one sector at a time, which allowed Confederate commanders to shift brigades and batteries to threatened points. They patched holes, launched local counterattacks, and kept the line from collapsing, while wounded men streamed toward barns and farmhouses turned into hospitals. By early afternoon, attention shifted to the southern end of the field. There, Antietam Creek bent near a stone arch bridge. Union General Ambrose Burnside's men had to force a crossing under fire from Confederate troops posted on high ground above the far bank. Several assaults were driven back as blue-coated files tried to cross the narrow span and recoil under musketry. The bridge became a funnel, concentrating men in a place the defenders could sweep from above. Time slipped away as officers debated whether to keep pressing the bridge directly or search for better fords downstream, and every lost hour helped Lee hold the rest of his battered line. At last, persistence and flank movements pushed the defenders from the bridge, and Union troops crossed into the countryside beyond. A breakthrough on Lee's right seemed possible. If Burnside's men could roll up the Confederate flank, Lee's army might be trapped against the Potomac. Yet the delay had given Lee something precious: time. A.P. Hill's division was marching hard from Harper's Ferry, closing on the battlefield in dusty columns after helping seize the Union garrison there.
Those men had already endured hard movement and fighting, but their arrival promised exactly what Lee needed most late in the day: fresh strength at the threatened end of his line.
Late in the day, Antietam balanced on a knife's edge. In the north and center, Union troops had seized terrible ground, but had not turned their gains into a coordinated drive. Behind the bloody lane, they stood where a deeper push might have threatened Sharpsburg and the Confederate rear. Instead, confusion, fatigue, and McClellan's fear of enemy reserves slowed the moment. Units that had already fought through terrible fire were not fresh instruments waiting to be pointed forward. They were shaken, scattered, and low on energy. Orders took time to move, staff officers debated risks, and precious minutes drained away.
On the southern flank, Burnside's advance also seemed close to a decisive result. His men pushed beyond the bridge and neared the outskirts of Sharpsburg, raising the possibility that Lee's retreat route might be cut. Then A.P. Hill's division arrived. Many of Hill's men wore captured Federal gear from Harper's Ferry, and they struck Burnside's exposed flank with just enough force to halt the Union advance and push parts of his command back toward the creek.
Hill's attack did not sweep the Army of the Potomac from the field. It did something more limited but crucial. It kept Lee's right from collapsing at the moment when collapse seemed possible. Combined with Union caution in the center and exhaustion across the field, that late arrival turned what could have become a crushing Confederate defeat into a bloody stalemate.
When darkness settled over Antietam Creek, more than 20,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing, making September 17, 1862, the bloodiest single day in American military history. The Miller cornfield lay flattened, the bloody lane was choked with fallen soldiers, and the ground near the bridge bore the marks of repeated assaults. Surgeons worked by lantern light in barns and farmhouses, while both armies tried to understand what the day had cost. For men who had started the morning in ordered ranks, the battlefield by night was nearly unrecognizable.
Tactically, the battle was a draw. Lee still held his line west of the creek on the night of the 17th, battered but unbroken. McClellan did not renew the attack on the 18th, still worried about Confederate strength and reluctant to commit his reserves to one more great test. That evening and into the night, Lee withdrew the Army of Northern Virginia back across the Potomac into Virginia. His first major invasion of Union territory had ended without the victory he wanted. The Confederates had not been destroyed, but they had been stopped.
Strategically, that mattered enormously. The Union had stopped Lee on Northern soil, and President Abraham Lincoln seized on Antietam as the victory he needed to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Within days, he announced that enslaved people in areas still in rebellion would be forever free as of January 1, 1863. The War for Union now also became a war against slavery, reshaping domestic politics and damaging Confederate hopes for recognition from European powers. Britain and France might still watch the war closely, but open support for a slave-holding rebellion now carried a heavier political cost.
For the soldiers who survived the cornfield, the road, and the bridge, Antietam became a memory of cost. For military history, it remains a lesson in intelligence, divided forces, coordinated attacks, terrain, and the consequences of caution at decisive moments. Staff rides and battlefield walks still return to the same questions. What could have happened if McClellan had struck faster, if the attacks had landed together, or if Burnside had crossed earlier? The answers are never simple, because the field was filled with exhaustion, confusion, smoke, and fear. What is clear is that the cornfield and creek stopped Lee's first invasion and gave the Union enough of a victory to change the war's purpose. The men who fought there could not know it at dawn, but by nightfall they had helped shift the course of the nation. Thank you for listening to this Headline Wednesday story from Dispatch United States Military History Magazine.
Headline Wednesday is developed by Trackpads.com as part of Dispatch United States Military History magazine.